Although from time to time there would be a resurgence of military power here or a florescence of the arts there, from now on the long-term trajectory would be inexorably downward. The early pharaohs of the new regime devoted themselves mainly to repairing the damage which had been done to the fabric of Egyptian civilization during the Amarna period. Horemheb, despite his military background, concentrated mostly on domestic affairs, especially those touching directly on the restoration of religious orthodoxy, civil harmony, and economic prosperity. The temples of the old gods were refurbished, the temple endowments were increased, and new cult images were provided at royal expense to replace the ones destroyed during Akhenaten's reign. The civil service, judiciary, and military were purged, reorganized, and subjected to stringent new measures to curb official corruption. Oppression of the poor and officially sponsored theft were especially targeted, with offenders subject to stringent penalties that included mutilation, exile, and even death. With domestic tranquility thus assured, Horemheb's successors could look further afield. Ramesses I, an elderly military officer and trusted associate of Horemheb, was designated by the latter as his heir in the absence of a son of his own body to succeed him. This first Ramesses survived for only a couple of years, just long enough to establish his son Seti I as his successor. Young and vigorous, Seti now proceeded to do abroad what Horemheb had accomplished at home. Nubia was smitten yet again, and encroaching Libyans were pushed back from the western delta. But most importantly, Seti fielded a major Egyptian army in Syria-Palestine for the first time in half a century. While he lacked the strength to recover much of the territory which had already been lost to the Hittites, he did succeed in stabilizing the border and preventing any further losses. With the borders of the empire once again secured, Seti was able to spend the rest of his reign in relative peace. He repaired the damage done by Akhenaten's agents in expunging Amun's name from temple walls and public monuments, continued the work of his predecessors on behalf of Amun's temples at Thebes, and invested the renewed flow of foreign tribute in major building projects throughout Egypt and Nubia, including an especially fine temple of Osiris at the ancient spiritual center of Abydos. Surprisingly, while Seti fervently hated Akhenaten and his immediate successors, and did everything in his power to obliterate their memory, his own reliefs exhibit a more mature version of the new artistic style, which Akhenaten had personally inaugurated. Seti's son and successor, Ramesses II, ruled for 67 years. During that time, he fathered more than 100 sons, whose descendants populated the country's civil service cadre for generations to come. He also put his own personal stamp on the material remains of Egypt forever after, not least because he inscribed his own cartouches on so many of his predecessors' artistic and architectural achievements. His actual accomplishments, however, were somewhat less than his propaganda suggests. His most notable achievement was the conclusion of a peace treaty with the Hittites. This had begun as an attempt to re-establish the old borders of Egypt in Syria-Palestine by forcing the Hittites back from their recent conquests there. The effort very nearly cost Ramesses II his life, however, when he was lulled into a false sense of security by Hittite disinformation and then caught unawares by a surprise attack near the city of Kadesh, a traditional enemy of Egypt which had been conquered by Thutmose III 2 centuries before but was now occupied by the Hittites. The Egyptian army broke and ran under the onslaught of a Hittite chariot attack, leaving the pharaoh and his bodyguard to carry on the battle alone. Fortunately for Ramses, a large part of the Hittite army paused to pillage the Egyptian camp instead of finishing off what was left of the Egyptian forces, and were then massacred amidst their plundering by newly arrived auxiliary troops dispatched from nearby Egyptian vassals. By this point, both armies were too battered to continue. The surviving Hittites took refuge within the walls of Kadesh, and the Egyptians returned to Egypt, where Ramses, true to form, proclaimed a great victory. Another dozen years of seesaw conflict between the two great powers failed to break the deadlock, and finally a treaty of peace was concluded in Ramesses II's 21st year on the throne. A decade and a half later, the new alliance was cemented by a visit from the Hittite king, and the marriage of Ramesses to that king's daughter. While Ramesses' propaganda attempted to portray all this as an Egyptian conquest of the Hittites, it was clearly nothing of the sort. but rather a mutually beneficial alliance which allowed two evenly matched parties to stop exhausting themselves against one another and devote themselves to more profitable endeavors. For Ramses, this meant a nationwide building program. New temples were erected in his name throughout the land, including the colossal temple at Abu Simbel in Nubia and improvements to the precincts of Amun at Thebes. Among his many other constructions was a new royal residence in the delta near the old Hyksos capital of Avaris. Ramses, of course, put his own name on it, Peremasu, the House of Ramessu. While the site itself is now utterly ruined, its name lives on in the Bible as one of the places in Egypt where the Hebrews were put to forced labor. By the time Ramesses' second son, Merneptah, came to the throne, the late Bronze Age was coming to an end. Climate changes and economic difficulties had spawned huge population movements, which would ultimately lead to the downfall of the Hittite kingdom and the severe weakening of Egypt itself. Merneptah managed to stave off the inevitable for a time by sending huge grain shipments to prop up his Hittite allies in the face of widespread famine, by decimating rebels and scattering troublesome nomads in Syria-Palestine, including a people named Israel, who thus enter written history for the first time, and most notably by crushing a massive Libyan invasion of the Delta and a simultaneous rebellion in Nubia. After that, there was relative peace for a time, but with Merneptah, the power of the 19th dynasty had been spent, and the reigns of his successors, Seti-Ta and Siptah, were distinguished mainly by problems with the succession. Finally, the dynasty fizzled out completely with the brief reign of a queen named Tuasret. The accession of a woman to the throne always signifying to the Egyptian mind that things had reached an intolerable state, which could not be allowed to continue. The 20th dynasty apparently began with the accession of a usurper, Set-Nekhti, whose primary accomplishment was the successful suppression of yet another Asiatic rebellion. But his son, Ramesses III, faced what was probably the greatest threat in the whole history of Egypt, the coming of the Sea Peoples. This was a loose coalition of nomads, mercenaries, and displaced peoples from all around the Mediterranean rim. Libyans, Lycians, Sardinians, Sicilians, Philistines, several varieties of Greeks, and many others, who were leveling whole civilizations in their search for land, food, and plunder. Everything fell before the Sea People's onslaught, including Mycenae, Troy, Cyprus, the mighty kingdom of the Hittites, the great city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, and most of the coastal cities of Phoenicia and Palestine. Finally, Egypt stood alone, and the hordes came against it as well. Over the course of several years, Ramses III successfully repelled two major invasions from the west, and a third consisting of a combined assault on the delta from the east by both land and sea. Tens of thousands of the enemy were slaughtered, perhaps hundreds of thousands captured or turned back. Egypt was saved, and its enemies were defeated yet again. But in the process, those enemies had inflicted upon Egypt a mortal wound. Ramesses III ended his days prosecuting a conspiracy hatched against him within his own palace by one of his own queens, along with some 40 other highly placed co-conspirators. After him came a long line of colorless kings all named Ramesses, numbered from 4 through 11, whose reigns, like that of Ramesses III himself, were marked by endless trouble. There were confused successions, civil disorders, including the robbing of tombs and the plundering of temples, increasingly severe economic difficulties such as rising prices, labor strikes, and food shortages, and declining Egyptian power and prestige abroad, 0.156. There was also still the problem of the ever-growing power of the priesthood of Amun at Thebes, which in the next dynasty would result in the formal division of Egypt into two separate states. The tale of Amenemope, to which we have already alluded in the introduction, was written at the end of this period and graphically demonstrates how even the personal envoy of Pharaoh could be insulted, robbed, and threatened by Egypt's former vassals with little or no fear of retaliation. Clearly, the era of Egyptian hegemony was over. Finally, at the death of Ramesses II, the 20th dynasty, the Ramesside era, and the New Kingdom all came to an end. Egypt would never be the same again.
Aftermath, the Third Intermediate and Late Periods, 1070 to 332 BC.
For our purposes, at least, the remainder of Egyptian history can be summarized in a quick sketch. By the end of Ramesses XI's reign, Egypt had been de facto divided into two separate states: a lower Egyptian kingdom ruled by a line of pharaohs from Tanis in the delta, about 20 miles from Avaris, and an upper Egyptian kingdom ruled from Thebes by the high priests of Amun. The former are known to historians as the 21st or Tanite dynasty. The latter have no dynastic label, since in theory they remained, at least for a time, as the vassals of Pharaoh. But clearly they functioned as kings in their own domain and thought of themselves as having royal prerogatives, including the right to surround their names with the cartouche. For us, the most interesting figure of the period is probably Sayyimun, who is thought by some to be the pharaoh who gave his daughter in marriage to King Solomon of Israel. The 21st dynasty ended when the throne was seized by its last pharaoh's military commander and son-in-law, Sheshonq-Twin. The latter was a Libyan from Bubastis, and hence the 22nd dynasty is sometimes called the Libyan or Bubasti dynasty. Sheshonq-Twin seems to have reversed his predecessor's support for the House of David, if indeed Sayyimun was actually as supportive as the biblical narrative suggests. First, he gave aid and comfort to Jeroboam, a rebel from Solomon's court who later became king of secessionist Israel after Solomon's death. And some years later, Sheshonq himself invaded and sacked both Israel and Judah. During the latter part of the 22nd dynasty, the political fabric of Egypt totally unraveled, and from then on the rulership of Egypt resembled a revolving door. While Sheshonq's successors continued to rule from Tanis, a 23rd dynasty was proclaimed at Leontopolis and a 24th at Sais, with additional separatist royal houses in other cities. This fragmentation led to a Nubian invasion, which unified the country under the 25th or Kushite dynasty, until the Nubians were in turn expelled by the Assyrians, who set up a puppet regime as the 26th or Site dynasty. Ironically, the Kushite and Site dynasties, despite their origins in foreign domination, experienced a new flowering of Egyptian antiquarianism, leading to a recovery of many of the literary and artistic norms of the Old and Middle Kingdoms, much to the chagrin of Egyptologists who have often been fooled by late-period fakes. Both dynasties also made their mark on the Hebrew Bible. It was a Kushite pharaoh, either Shabaka or his successor Shabitku, who induced Judah's Hezekiah to revolt against his Assyrian masters, resulting in the loss of most of Judah's territory and the payment of a heavy tribute. It was the Site pharaoh Necho who killed Judah's pious king Josiah for interfering in his drive against the Babylonians at Carchemish. And it was another Site pharaoh, either Samtik-Tesek or his successor Wahibra, who induced Judah's king Zedekiah to rebel against his Babylonian overlords, resulting in the total destruction of the Temple of Solomon at Jerusalem and the deportation of much of Judah's population to Babylon. The Sate dynasty, in its turn, was overthrown by the Persians, who ruled as the 27th. This was then overthrown by native Egyptians, who ruled as the 28th, 29th, and 30th dynasties, only to be overwhelmed by a second Persian invasion which ruled as the 31st. Finally, in 332 BC, Alexander the Great put Egypt out of its misery and incorporated it into its world empire. There would not be another native Egyptian ruler until the 20th century.
Chapter 2. Literary Context. Writing and Mad in Ancient Egypt.
As for those learned scribes from the time that came after the gods, those who predicted what was to come, they have become men whose names endure forever. They did not make for themselves tombs of copper with stelae of metal from heaven. They knew not how to leave heirs, children to pronounce their names. They made for themselves heirs from their writings, from instructions which they had composed. They appointed for themselves the papyrus roll as a lector priest and the writing board as a loving son. The instructions are their tombs, the reed pen their child, the stone surface a wife. Their portals and mansions have crumbled, their cost servants are gone, their tombstones are covered with soil, their graves are forgotten, but their names are pronounced over their books, which they made while they had being. Good is the memory of their makers. It is forever and eternity. Chester Beatty Papyrus 4, Casa 1200 BC. Now that we have situated the Instruction of Amenemope within its historical and religious context, we need to locate it within its literary context as well. As we will see, Amenemope is far from unique among the writings of ancient Egypt. To the contrary, it is only one example of a rather large and widely distributed body of such texts, which can be found not only in Egypt itself, but among many of its neighbors as well.
Writing, scribes, and literacy in ancient Egypt.
Ancient Egyptian is classed as an Afro-Asiatic language, one with affinities to both the Semitic tongues of West Asia, Akkadian, Arabic, Hebrew, etc., and the Hamitic tongues of North Africa, Berber, Cushitic, Chadic. Linguists discern 5 major phases of the language: Old, Middle, Late, Demotic, and Coptic. Old Egyptian was the bureaucratic and religious language of the Old Kingdom and the First Intermediate Period, i.e. the 1st through 10th dynasties. The written form of the language seems originally to have evolved, probably under Mesopotamian influence, from the crude picture writing displayed on the palettes of the pre-dynastic kings. But despite its humble beginnings, the new writing system progressed rapidly. By the start of the dynastic era, hieroglyphic writing was already well developed in both formal and cursive representations, and by the 5th dynasty, a ligatured script, known since Greco-Roman times as hieratic, had also appeared. In the earliest dynasties, the writing system's applications seem to have been largely restricted to name tags, monumental captions, inventories, and mortuary offering lists. But from the 3rd dynasty onward, it is found in more widespread use, including royal decrees, legal documents, the pyramid texts inscribed in royal tombs, the autobiographical compositions in private tombs, and personal letters to both the living and the dead. This rapid expansion into new genres may have resulted from a reform of the writing system instituted by Imhotep, the chief advisor of King James. Middle Egyptian was the classical language of ancient Egypt, and was written in a simplified and standardized version of the same hieroglyphic and hieratic forms as Old Egyptian. It made its first appearance as a spoken language at the end of the Old Kingdom, and as a written language in the First Intermediate Period. With Middle Egyptian, we first begin to see writing used for private religious documents such as the coffin texts, as well as a more extensive production of personal letters, and even the composition of entertaining literary texts. All evidence of a democratization of writing, which, not surprisingly, parallels the democratization of religion we have already discussed. As a result, Middle Egyptian is attested in an immense literature, which includes all the genres of the Old Kingdom plus new ones previously unknown: songs and hymns, narrative fiction, scholarly treatises on medicine and mathematics, encyclopedic name lists or onomastica, and the flowering of the didactic or instructional genre, which later gave rise to Amenemope. Middle Egyptian remained the language of the state until the Amarna period of the New Kingdom, and after that, in a modified version sometimes called Late Middle Egyptian, it continued as the standard language of monumental inscriptions and religious texts until the Greco-Roman era. Late Egyptian probably already existed as a spoken language by the end of the Second Intermediate Period, but it was not until the linguistic reforms of Pharaoh Akhenaten that it came to be widely used in writing. Late Egyptian was the language of the Ramesside governmental apparatus and is also well attested in love poetry, in narrative and mythological texts like the Tale of Two Brothers, and in numerous didactic texts, including the Instruction of Amenemope. Like its predecessors, Late Egyptian was also written in traditional hieroglyphic and hieratic signs, although with substantial changes reflecting the phonetic evolution of the language since the classical period. Demotic first appeared in the Site period and continued through the Greco-Roman era, with the last known texts being composed in the 5th century AD. It was based on the late period vernacular and was written in a convoluted and highly formalized script which developed in Lower Egypt from Late Egyptian hieratic. It is attested in administrative documents, narrative texts, and didactic works such as the Instruction of Amenemope Coptic, the final stage of the language, appeared at the beginning of the Christian era and continued as a living tongue for another 1,000 years. Coptic is written in a modified version of the Greek alphabet, and is now used only in the liturgy of the Coptic Church. Unlike spoken language, which can be passed on effortlessly from one generation to the next, a writing system can only survive by formal instruction. Hence, it is probably no accident that, in Egypt, the written language appeared simultaneously with political unification at the start of the dynastic era. The administration of an organized state inevitably requires some sort of bureaucracy, and the economic and political totalitarianism practiced during the Old Kingdom would have needed a large body of scribes to document land allocations and transfers, tax payments, state and temple inventories, administrative decrees, judicial decisions, and so forth. In fact, from present evidence, it appears that the use of writing for religious texts and literary compositions was a secondary development. The original motivation for the invention of writing in Egypt and its primary use in the early centuries was almost solely for bureaucratic administration and political propaganda. It is no surprise, therefore, that already in the Old Kingdom we find references to the hosts of royal scribes who staffed government offices, and even a few mentions of pharaohs who could both read and write. All, we must assume, the products of some system of instruction. The earliest references to education seem to envision a master instructing his apprentice. Often enough, the master was the student's own father, who was consciously grooming his son to succeed him. This practice left a permanent mark on the vocabulary of Egyptian education. Forever after, scribal instructors, including most notably the authors of instructional literature, commonly addressed their students as "my son," regardless of actual family relationship. The first clear evidence for the existence of scribal schools, as opposed to one-on-one private instruction, emerges in the first intermediate period with a reference in a 10th dynasty tomb inscription to the At-Nsba, or House of Instruction. By the Middle Kingdom, there are explicit references to formal schools operating in the palace to raise up the next generation of royal bureaucrats, a result, most likely, of the consolidation of centralized authority in the 12th dynasty. It is in this period as well that we find the beginnings of an apologetic literature which exalts the scribal profession above all others, a genre to which we shall return shortly. By the time of the New Kingdom, scribal instruction was both broader and more systematic than it had been in prior ages, with schools operating both in the royal palace and in numerous temples. Some of these operated as boarding schools, but the literature clearly indicates that there were also day schools, and that at least some of the students who attended them were from less privileged families. Perhaps as a result, literacy now began to extend beyond the bounds of the scribal profession itself. Just as the aristocratic coffin texts had evolved into a popular Book of the Dead accessible to anyone with the money to buy one, so now we find writing widely used for everyday affairs, even among the upper levels of the working class. There were, of course, no public schools or other institutions dedicated to educating the masses, and both reading and writing remained the domain of the few rather than the many. According to current estimates, literacy ranged from less than 1% of the population under the Old Kingdom to perhaps 5% in the specialized New Kingdom workmen's community of Deir el-Medina, which was attached to the Theban necropolis and hence benefited from royal patronage. Here we find ample evidence for the keeping of family records, the widespread exchange of personal letters, and the accumulation of private libraries containing favorite literary, religious, and medical texts. Even those who were not fully literate might still be capable of inscribing their own names on a legal document, or scratching out some choice comments about a boss or co-worker on the valley walls for the amusement of those who passed by. Students in the scribal schools initially learned to read and write by spending several years reciting and copying from stock text, before being apprenticed to an individual master for practical instruction in their future specialization. This rote learning and copying gave rise to a number of standardized school texts, which were considered canonical compositions, and hence were copied again and again, generation after generation. It is to this repeated, if often inept, copying by scribal novices that we owe the survival of many Egyptian texts, including a number of fragments of Amenemope. From the apologetic tracts contained in the school texts, we can deduce that scribal candidates needed to be quick-witted, nimble-fingered, and articulate, that they probably began their schooling shortly before reaching puberty, and that as they grew older they were constantly tempted to spend their time hunting and fishing, partying, chasing girls, and generally raising hell instead of studying. Such failure to be diligent about his lessons could earn the would-be scribe a good thrashing, or even a prolonged time out in the stocks. Indeed, so integral was corporal punishment to the discipline of the schools that sba, the Egyptian verb for teach, was often written with the determinative for the application of physical force. As one of the school texts says, "A boy's ear is upon his back, and he listens when he is beaten." On the other hand, there were clearly long-term advantages for those who learned their lessons well. The capable scribe, we are told, was befriended by his betters, outfitted in fine clothes, supplied with horses and boats and attendants and a large house in town, given prestigious offices, sent on important missions and trusted by the king. Compared to the soldier, the craftsman, the manual laborer, or the peasant, the scribe's lot in life seems to have been viewed as almost paradisiacal, not least because his career ladder could easily reach into the highest ranks of the government or temple. In fact, at least two royal scribes, Imhotep in the 3rd dynasty and Amenhotep, son of Hapu, in the 18th, were esteemed so highly in life that they were deified after their deaths, and continued to be invoked as divine intercessors even into the Greco-Roman era. The scribe's unique role and status in Egyptian society has been well summarized by Ehrman. Through the Egyptian people from the earliest period there ran a deep cleavage, which separated him who had enjoyed a higher education from the common mass. It came into existence when the Egyptians had invented their writing, for he who mastered it, however humble his position might outwardly be, at once gained a superiority over his fellows. Without the assistance of his scribes, even the ruler was now of no account, and it was not without good reason that the high officials of the Old Kingdom were so fond of having themselves represented in writing posture, for that was the occupation to which they owed their rank and their power. The road to every office lay open to him who had learnt writing and knew how to express himself in well-chosen terms, and all other professions were literally under his control. This, to our eyes, inordinate prestige attached to even the lowliest scribe was not based merely on the economic perks he received, nor on the socio-economic power he might wield, though neither of these was insignificant. The scribe's status also benefited from the fact that he was one of the few who could manipulate written symbols, which were believed to have inherent magical power. Indeed, the hieroglyphic and hieratic signs which the scribe had to master, or more accurately, the words which those signs conveyed, were called by the Egyptians Mduan Tree, God's speech. This reflects the fact that the writing system was believed to have been invented by Thoth, the god of wisdom. As the lord of the ancient city of Hermopolis, Thoth was a major deity in his own right, and as the divine scribe who recorded the other gods' judgments and decrees, he was the patron deity of all scribes everywhere, who were therefore commonly referred to as the followers of Thoth. The personal devotion which a conscientious scribe felt toward his god can be seen in a prayer found on the funerary statue of a scribe who lived in the Deir el-Medina workmen's community. The text begins, "Thoth, lord of southern Heliopolis, vizier who reveals Mot and reckons Mot, who loves Mot and gives Mot to the doer of Mot." He then goes on to say, "May I satisfy the august God who is pleased with Mot. Thoth, lord of God's speech, skilled scribe of the Ennead, who does not waver in his dealings, vizier who reveals Mot, who does not act ignorantly toward gods or men." Given this scribal focus on Thoth as lord of Mot, it is no surprise that the Instruction of Amenemope repeatedly insists on the absolute necessity for the individual scribe to uphold Mot in both his professional and his personal life, lest he incur the wrath of the god. As one Egyptologist aptly put it, the SBA, par excellence, is Thoth, who instructs but if necessary also chastises. The pious scribe therefore began his workday by offering to his god prayers and incense, or at least a libation of water. A typical scribe's kit included a small statuette of Thoth in the form of a baboon, and there are numerous depictions of the scribe performing his duties under that entity's watchful eye. The rest of the scribe's equipment and modus operandi can easily be discerned both from material remains and tomb illustrations. The Old Kingdom version of the scribe's kit can be seen in the hieroglyph used to represent scribes in writing. It consisted of a rectangular wooden palette with 2 depressions for the standard black and red inks, a cylindrical storage container with lengths of rushes or reeds to be used as pens, and a leather bag for odds and ends such as pigments, weights, bowls, etc. These three major components were tied together so as to allow the whole assemblage to be worn over one shoulder, thereby leaving the hands free to carry individual scrolls, storage containers, or other scribal equipment. While this exact design was obsolete by the middle of the Old Kingdom, subsequent implementations always betrayed their descent from this basic form. As for the writing surface itself, this depended on both the subject matter and the available materials. Monumental inscriptions and mortuary texts, which were at least theoretically intended to last forever, were typically implemented in hieroglyphs either painted on plaster or incised in stone or gilded wood. From the very beginning of Egyptian history, however, the overwhelming majority of records were written in ink on papyrus, usually in the form of scrolls, although some short compositions, especially personal letters, might be folded rather than rolled. These scrolls were manufactured out of long fibers obtained from the stalk of the papyrus sedge, which then grew wild in the Egyptian marshlands. The plant is now virtually extinct in Egypt itself, although it still has a wide range in Central Africa. The freshly extracted fibers were laid out in mats, 2 layers thick, with the second layer at right angles to the first. These were beaten with a mallet until the fibers were mashed together into a uniform, flat surface, and then dried and bleached in the open sun. The resulting sheets were trimmed to a rectangle of uniform size, which varied considerably over time, and then glued together to form scrolls of standard heights and lengths. The finished scroll was rolled with the vertical fibers on the outside of the roll. Modern scholarship typically refers to this side as the verso. The inner or recto side, which has the fibers running horizontally, was the preferred writing surface. If a scroll was inscribed on only one side, this is the one that was almost always used. When papyrus was in short supply or when the texts in question were not considered important enough to justify its expense, documents might also be written on ostraka, i.e. shards of broken pottery or leftover flakes of stone from quarrying and construction. A few such examples are known even from the Old Kingdom, but they were especially common in the New Kingdom workmen's communities. Linen and leather are also attested as writing materials, although in much smaller quantities, the former mainly for grave goods and the latter for reference copies of important documents in legal and religious archives. For writing practice or other temporary notations, scribes also utilized wooden writing tablets. Until the end of the New Kingdom, these typically were fairly large and covered with plaster for easier erasure. But thereafter, the boards grew smaller and the writing was inscribed on the bare surface of the wood. And of course, there was also the occasional graffito scribbled on any convenient surface, including the walls of tombs and temples. Portions of the Instruction of Amenemope can be found in several of these different media. Scribes are sometimes portrayed as writing in a standing position, e.g., while serving in the field as tax assessors or squatting at makeshift desks in government offices. Most often, however, the scribe wrote while seated in a cross-legged posture, with his kilt stretched tight across his thighs as a writing surface. This is how scribes are generally portrayed in mortuary statues. The orientation and organization of the writing itself depended on both the period and the genre. Before the Middle Kingdom, most writing was done in vertical columns, with the columns progressing from right to left. This format continued thereafter in formal religious texts, such as the Book of the Dead, whose sanctity also required that it be written in cursive hieroglyphic instead of hieratic. It was also commonly retained in the most basic instructional texts used in the scribal schools, but during the 12th dynasty, most other hieratic texts began to be written in horizontal lines from right to left, and thereafter this remained the standard practice for as long as the language itself survived. Most often the text would be written continuously, without regard for the structure of paragraphs, sentences, or sometimes even words. In poetic and literary texts, however, verse structure might be indicated either by placing each verse line on a separate physical line or else by marking the ends of individual verse lines in continuous text with the small red dots which modern scholars call verse points. This practice first appeared in ritual texts of the late 12th dynasty, and by the New Kingdom had spread to literary texts as well. As we shall see in the next chapter, both physical separation of verse lines and virtual separation by means of verse points are found in surviving copies of Amenemope. Moreover, some texts were explicitly divided into chapters, known in Egyptian as hat or houses. This usage goes all the way back to the 6th dynasty pyramid texts, in which columnar blocks of writing on the tomb walls were sometimes framed within horizontal and vertical lines, arranged so as to resemble the hieroglyph. By the New Kingdom, this visual arrangement had been abandoned, in part because few texts were being written in vertical columns any longer, but chapter divisions could still be indicated implicitly by writing the start of each chapter in red ink, or explicitly by the use of numbered chapter headings. Both techniques were used in Amenemope. Red ink was also used for other distinctive portions of the text, including column totals, dates, certain technical terms, such as the word for emmer, which was thus distinguished from other kinds of grain with which it might be confused, directions on the proper use of the text, and corrections of scribal errors. Apart from these specialized parts of the text, commonly called rubrics because of their red color, the only color of ink used was black. In addition to the employment opportunities offered by the sprawling governmental bureaucracy, it seems that a considerable number of scribes must have been regularly employed in the Prologue or House of Life, a scriptorium and research facility which would have been attached to almost every temple of significant size. It was the scribes of the House of Life who composed the royal titulary, supervised the inscription of sacred texts on temple walls, and produced the specialized scrolls required for religious festivals and medical practice. It seems they were also the ones who mass-produced the many commemorative stelae and copies of the Book of the Dead which were required by the funerary trade. In addition, because of the tendency of papyrus and leather to deteriorate when exposed to moisture, it is quite likely that a fair number of scribes were kept busy recopying old texts which had been, as the records themselves report, eaten by worms. Despite years of intensive education and apprenticeship followed by on-the-job training, and despite, one may presume, reasonable diligence on the part of most of those who went on to gainful employment as professional scribes, the fact is that the typical scribal product was far from perfect. Many surviving manuscripts are replete with scribal gaffes, including omissions, repetitions, transpositions, misspellings of every conceivable variety, and accidental or deliberate substitutions and alterations. In some instances, the scribe was merely repeating errors which were already present in the exemplar from which he was working, but of course, he might also introduce new errors of his own. And in either case, mistakes were sometimes caught and corrected before the manuscript was finalized. This could be done by writing the proper signs on top of the erroneous ones, with or without erasing the latter first, by lining out the offending signs and writing the correct ones after or above them, by placing missing or corrected signs in the margin, and so forth. Several such corrections appear in our copies of Amenemope. In far too many cases, however, serious errors went unnoticed and uncorrected, and some manuscripts are so badly written as to be virtually unintelligible. To some extent, mistakes in hieratic texts were almost inevitable due to the nature of the hieratic script itself. For one thing, there was a natural tendency over time for complex signs to become more simplified, for radically different hieroglyphic signs to converge toward similar hieratic representations, and for the most frequently used signs to be abbreviated down to indistinguishable strokes and ticks, which might be read as any number of things, depending on context. For another, hieratic, like any cursive script, varies significantly from time to time, place to place, and scribe to scribe. This has certain advantages for us today, since it allows us with some measure of confidence to assign extant copies to a particular time and place, and even to the hand of a particular scribe. But from the perspective of scribal accuracy, the variability of hieratic created manifold opportunities for misinterpreting the meaning of the original, and thereby introducing novel errors into every new copy that was made. Until fairly recently, it had been assumed that both student scribes and professionals typically wrote from oral dictation. While dictation was indeed used on occasion, especially with texts written in a form of the language which was unlikely to be misunderstood by the hearer, more recent research has demonstrated that most manuscript copies were made by the individual scribe working directly from a written exemplar. These has important implications for our understanding of the causes and nature of scribal errors, since visual mistakes are quite different from auditory ones. Another frequent source of errors was the use of memorization as a teaching tool in the schools. With a large body of memorized texts lurking in the back of the scribe's mind as he wrote, It would have required extraordinary diligence and constant checking of the exemplar to prevent the memorized materials from interfering with the accurate reproduction of the text that was actually before him. Yet another source of textual garbling was the phonetic and grammatical change which the Egyptian language underwent over the course of centuries and millennia. While Old and Middle Kingdom texts continued to be copied and read even into the late period, they were written in a language so different from that of their later readers that they would have been at least as difficult for them to decipher as Old English is for us. To some extent, this problem was addressed in the schools by the creation of modernized editions of the old classics. One clear example is the Instruction of Ptah-hotep, which exists in distinct recensions of widely differing dates. In general, there was a tendency among Egyptian scribes, as indeed among scribes everywhere, to render archaic texts more intelligible on the fly by substituting more modern orthography, vocabulary, grammar, and syntax for expressions which had become obsolete. Foster succinctly described the difficulties this can create for modern scholars. If the original was Middle Egyptian, the copies are Ramesside and thus often Late Egyptian in spelling. Upon a vocabulary and syntax which are Middle Egyptian are superimposed syllabic spellings, additional, seemingly superfluous, and sometimes misleading determinatives, the twift to ending to indicate pronunciation of the final ton nouns, and so on. Since these are some of the very features which are used to assess the age of ancient texts, such scribal alterations can immensely complicate the task of determining when a particular text was originally composed, or when a particular copy of the text was made. As we shall see, the Instruction of Amenemope is no exception to this rule. To make matters even more interesting, in several periods of Egyptian history, there was an officially sponsored antiquarianism which sought to reinstate the artistic and literary norms of the past. One example of this process was the reform of the writing system during the reign of Thutmose III in an attempt to bring official hieratic into closer conformity with the corresponding hieroglyphic signs. Another was the resurrection of a purer form of Middle Egyptian at the end of the 20th dynasty as a scholastic language which was no longer understood even by a majority of the scribes. Such efforts could easily lead to the reintroduction of archaic vocabulary and grammar in formal texts, and the production of documents which give the appearance of having been produced centuries before their time. There were also instances in which a facility with the earlier stages of the language was deliberately used to fabricate ancient documents in support of a present agenda. The premier example, the so-called Memphite theology of Pharaoh Shabaka, comes from the Kushite period. It was so well crafted that until recently it was almost universally believed to be an exact copy of an actual Old Kingdom text, which had been recovered and published under the 25th dynasty. It is now widely held to have been composed during that dynasty for purposes of political and religious propaganda. Finally, there is the issue of Semitic influence and borrowed vocabulary. As we mentioned in the previous chapter, substantial Semitic populations from Syria-Palestine were present in Egypt throughout most of its history. Whether they came as conquerors during periods of internal weakness, as refugees during drought and famine, or as prisoners captured in war and put to work as slave laborers, they inevitably had an effect on the Egyptian language. This was further reinforced during the New Kingdom by the wholesale importation of crafts and luxury goods, along with the associated vocabulary from Egypt's trading partners and colonial possessions, by the need for scribes to be conversant with the technical terminology encountered by Egyptian troops and officials in the Egyptian vassal states, and by the multilingual nature of international diplomatic correspondence, which during this period was conducted almost entirely in Aramaic. The primary challenge presented by borrowed foreign vocabulary was finding a way to represent it adequately in writing, given the consonants-only system which was used for native Egyptian words. With the latter, the reader presumably already knew, from long-standing familiarity with his own native tongue, the range of possible words which the written signs might represent, and how those words ought to be pronounced in context. With foreign words, however, the reader might receive no clues whatever from his native speech, and hence would be utterly at a loss as to how to proceed. The scribal response to this challenge was the invention of the syllabic writing system, which scholars refer to as group writing. This allowed both consonants and vowels to be specified in the writing of non-Egyptian words. so that anyone who knew the group writing conventions could pronounce such words correctly. The first form of this system, which had already been developed in the Old Kingdom and became highly systematized in the Middle Kingdom, became unstable during the Hyksos period and was ultimately replaced by a somewhat different one during the New Kingdom. This later approach to group writing was much more complex than the earlier one and therefore more confusing, and it was often abused rather badly by inept scribes. It is unfortunately this later system which is used in Amenemope, thereby making that text decipherment just a bit more challenging. Once the writing of a scroll was completed, it would of course in most cases be stored away for future reference. Private documents might be kept in clay pots or wooden chests in the home. Institutional documents were housed in an office archive or in the temple library, which was known appropriately enough as the Prolegomenon or House of Books. From the surviving records of papyrus production and consumption, it is clear that the Nile Valley was once awash in scrolls containing everything from esoteric religious texts and great literary works to tax ledgers and private correspondence. Almost all of it has now perished, a victim of both human folly and natural decay. What is left to us today is mostly scraps, which must be painstakingly reconstructed and analyzed by scholars to squeeze out every last drop of information. Fortunately for our purposes, the Instruction of Amenemope has survived virtually intact, one of the few literary works of ancient Egypt to do so.
Situating Amenemope, intertextuality, and genre.
As we noted in the introduction, before a work of literature can be properly understood, it must be situated within the broader context of its own time and place, and especially within the context of its own literary genre, and any other genres to which it is closely related. We have already seen that ancient Egyptian literature encompassed a number of such genres, including magical, medical, and mortuary texts, historical and autobiographical inscriptions, secular songs and religious hymns, and narrative tales. The variety of literary types increased over time. In particular, the bureaucratic consolidations following the First and Second Intermediate periods and the Amarna crisis each resulted in an expansion of literacy and a consequent extension of writing to new genres, which previously had only been transmitted orally. Further, Egyptian authors, like their contemporaries in other ancient Near Eastern cultures, were especially fond of embedding text fragments from one genre within a textual frame from a different genre, thereby making the task of genre analysis considerably more difficult. This does not mean that the task can be abandoned, however, since genre is crucial to the comprehension of a text. It simply means that the task must be approached with greater care. Another characteristic of Egyptian literature, which must be taken into consideration, is what modern scholars call intertextuality, i.e., the dependence of later texts on the body of earlier literature, and the frequent use of allusion, quotation, and formulae in the creation of each individual work. Most Egyptian literary texts not only share the vocabulary and cultural assumptions of earlier works, in many cases they also consciously allude to those works through imitation, paraphrase, or even direct quotation, usually without any form of explicit attribution. As a result, one simply cannot understand an individual Egyptian literary work without extensive reference to other works of the same and related genres. One might almost say that it is necessary to approach virtually the entire body of Egyptian literature holistically. As La Prieno put it, the intertextuality of Egyptian literature means that a text is never a truly original creation of its author, but is part of a dynamic universe of texts with which it dialectically interrelates. This is especially true of the Ramesside period, during which, as we shall see in the next chapter, Amenemope was composed. There were several reasons for the prominence of intertextuality in Egyptian literary composition. First, there was the restriction of literacy to a prosperous and well-educated elite, which by its very nature tended to be inward-looking and self-sufficient. Closely related to this was the role of tradition and authority in Egyptian society. Like everything else, artistic expression was obliged to serve the established order, and artistic technique was highly constrained by strict rules of decorum,